Welcome. This is Chapter 7, using Object-Oriented JavaScript. So let's jump right into it, shall we? So in this class, we're going to talk a lot about the basic concepts related to OOP. We're also going to talk and go over the date, number, and math objects. And we're also going to talk about how to define your own custom JavaScript objects. So, what is object-oriented programming? Well, it's a lot of things. I know that this says that it allows you to reuse code without having to copy and recreate it, but it's more than that. It's a compilation of principles that make your code scalable and usable at a level that is higher than what declarative or functional programming can do for you. So long ago, there were 4 different principles that were created where object-oriented programming was concerned: abstraction, polymorphism, inheritance, and encapsulation. Abstraction is basically exactly what it sounds like, but it's more than what it sounds like. You're creating abstract objects that can be reused over and over again throughout the code. For instance, an abstract class is an abstract object which can be reused over and over again throughout your code. Yada, yada, yada. Polymorphism is the ability to create modulars or modules within your code so that they can be invoked throughout your code. Now, I understand that there's a more dynamic and academic way to explain that, but that's really what it is. Encapsulation is being able to hide your algorithms within your code so that they can't be manipulated outside of your code, and or protect or privatize them so they're not accessible to any other parts of your code. This is a security feature in object-oriented programming. And lastly, there's inheritance. Inheritance is the ability to inherit objects, inherit functions, inherit variables, whatever, from another class altogether. Now, I don't think that object-oriented programming is, in its purest form, can be attributed to JavaScript, but certain parts of object-oriented programming can. So, for instance, inheritance does not exist in JavaScript in the way that we understand it exists in C#, Java, C, and C++. Polymorphism does, where we can modularize or create modules within the code that allow us to reuse pieces of the code within that script file or that HTML document. Also, JavaScript does employ abstraction at a very simple level. Data types are quite dynamic and, for the most part, ignored in JavaScript, but that doesn't take away from its abstractive properties. And like inheritance, encapsulation is another piece of JavaScript which can or cannot be attributed to object-oriented programming in JavaScript as a language. For the most part, encapsulation is used in C# and C++ and Java, and in most situations, you can see it in action, whereas in JavaScript you can't. So, as we said in the last slide, object-oriented programming allows you to create reusable software objects and easily incorporate this into multiple programs. Now, the issue with this is that JavaScript is inherently siloed, meaning that only one JavaScript file can contain or access the functions of that file. You could try to make those methods or functions, you could try to make your functions accessible to other JavaScript files in your code, but it's not as easy as it looks, which is why there's AngularJS as a framework and whatnot to allow you to do that. What's the object in your code? It's the code and or data that's treated like an individual unit or component. So for the most part, an object can be anything. Anything and nothing all at the same time. A variable is an object. A function is an object. A method is an object. Now, if you're talking in terms of a data type, an object is anything that has not been predefined as a integer, float, string, yada, yada, yada. It's pretty much a thing that has no value, no data type value. In JavaScript, an object is pretty much anything. The data is information, and this definition is already incorrect, but I'm going to quote it anyway because I don't want to confuse you. Data is information contained within variables or other types of storage structures. If you've taken SQL or any type of data class, you will know that data and information are not one and the same. Data is a value at its purest form. Information is a compilation of different data sets or different datum that make the data valuable. So for instance, if I had your address and your address was 123 Bear Lane, 123 Bear Lane in and of itself is information. But what if I only had the number of your street, 123? Or let's take it a step further. What if I only had the first digit of the number of your street, 1? Well, that's data. It has no inherent meaning whatsoever, but it is a piece of value that we can put together with other pieces of value to create information. So within the context of this definition, data being information is kind of a paradox or an oxymoron, if you will. It's the other way around. Data is really, that should be replaced with the word values contained within variables or other types of storage structures. So, objects range from simple controls to entire programs. And we've just talked about all that. So, we can create our own objects. We can manipulate objects that are created by programmers. And then by combining the two or using one and or the other, we then create our program. So what's encapsulation? And I know I went over this very briefly. Encapsulation is code and data contained within the object itself. Encapsulation places code inside of a black box. Now, I just actually went over this with you. Encapsulation allows you to create a pseudo-security for your code. It's the idea of obstruction through information hiding. I'm not saying that correctly, but for the most part, what it is you're hiding your core algorithms away from outside influencers. Remember we talked last week about information security and how there are individuals with malicious intent who can manipulate your code by injecting JavaScript into your DOM. Encapsulation allows, even if that code is injected into your DOM, that they can't manipulate your algorithms. The principle of information hiding is that any method or property that other programmers do not need to access should be hidden. So the advantage of encapsulation, as we've already stated, is that it reduces code complexity and it prevents accidental bugs and stealing of code. One other added benefit is that your algorithms stay the way they should stay. So they're using a calculator, an actual handheld calculator, as a example. And in this example, you are, or you, the program, the hand, is asking the object, the calculator object, for a specific value. And what we do is we present the program with a set of interfaces and properties to manipulate, but it never really gets the opportunity to actually go inside the calculator and manipulate the algorithms itself. So the document object is encapsulated in a black box. This is true. The getElementById method is part of the interface JavaScript uses to communicate with the document object. So, and then it uses Microsoft Word as an example. But just know that we ourselves don't go into the DOM and pick out IDs. We use a method, and the method goes and gets that specific tag. That is a form of encapsulation. However, I would argue that that's not necessarily JavaScript itself doing that, but c'est la vie. So classes. This is something that JavaScript doesn't necessarily have. Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that this slideshow is going to try to discredit what I'm about to say. JavaScript, one of its main drawbacks is that it doesn't have classes. Now, what are classes? Classes are groups of code, methods, and attributes that make up an object or hold a compilation of like objects. So you can create a class called the print class. And in that print class, the only things that are there are things which either assist or operate a print type property. An instance is an object created from an existing class. So when you get the error, object not reference to an instance of an object, that error is actually telling you that the instance that you are trying to invoke does not exist. The word instantiation I've used a lot throughout this class. Instantiation means to create an object from an existing class. If I wanted to instantiate a variable, I can instantiate a variable from another class. Instance of an object inherits its methods and properties from a class. Objects in the browser object model, are part of the web browser, do not have a need for instantiation. They already exist within the context of your code. You don't have to construct them. Hence the reason why we don't write constructors for JavaScript like we do in other languages. And here are some built-in JavaScript classes that we manipulate every now and again. Now, I myself wouldn't call these things classes. They're part of the library, but I understand where they're going with this. Instantiating an object is the ability to actually take an object and use it where you need to use it. So we can use the math object pi property in a script, for example. What we're actually doing in this script, and I was reading it just to get an idea, is that we're instantiating the math object, and then we're using the math object to do a calculation. So in this case, math.pi will give you 3.14 and whatever the subsequent numbers after that are. Math.pow is a method that will give you area, I believe, or perimeter. I don't remember what it actually does, but it does a calculation as well, and then you can calculate both answers and return area. But the instantiation of the math object is what they're talking about here. And you've done instantiation throughout this class already. As a matter of fact, inadvertently, you have done instantiation when you've loaded a getElementById.value into a variable and then use that. You can instantiate arrays. You can instantiate this as an empty generic object, but object literal is the right name. Object literal here. And object literal is exactly what I was telling you it is earlier. It's a hash table, really. That's all it is. The difference between an object literal and an array is that the array only possesses a value. It possesses nothing else but the value. Whereas the object literal contains your key and a value, so that you can use dot notation to pull one or the other. However, you cannot use an object literal for a date object. You can only use a constructor new date. It is one of the only objects in the JavaScript library that you have to instantiate new. All right, let's continue. So, what's garbage collection? And I'm not talking about, the garbage outside your house. Garbage collection literally is reclaiming the memory that was used when you did a certain thing with your code. If you've done anything with C++ and C, you'll know that there were a lot of memory collection, garbage collection issues with those languages. Most notably, buffer overflow was one of the big issues with C++. C# also has garbage collection issues. Even though the iDisposable is supposed to fix all of that, it doesn't. And in most situations, what it does is it makes the problem worse. And so a lot of developers go in and dispose of objects even after the fact because they want to make sure the object has been disposed of. Declaring a variable or instantiating a new object reserves memory for the variable or object. So every time you call var, and I said this in the beginning of the class, I don't like variables because every time you call a variable, it reserves a new slot, a new memory location, a new memory value in your RAM every single time. However, if you call a hash table, a object literal instead, it only reserves one memory location. Arrays also reserve multiple memory locations as well based on the amount of positions are in the array, technically. JavaScript knows when a program no longer needs a variable or object and automatically cleans up the memory. There are situations where it doesn't. Variables in and of themselves don't always go away, which is why it is best practice to use let instead of variables. Once a function has been executed and you use the word let, what happens is that the variable is destroyed after the function is run. The word let, L-E-T, is the same as the word var. It does the same thing. The only difference is var is more loosely defined than let. With let, I can't have two lets that have the same name, no matter if they're global or in a function. They cannot have the same name. I also can't have, I can have two variables of the same name, and that makes things a lot harder to debug. The three most commonly used JavaScript classes are date, number, and math. The date class does exactly what you think it does, and you used it last week for your assignments. The date method, or the date class, has methods which allow you to manipulate the date, which allow you to pull specific aspects of the date, like the day or the month. It lets you skip forward the weeks, skip back the weeks, or just get today's date. It allows you to convert the date to UTC string or to Zulu time based on what you want. The date class has a lot of different objects in it that you can manipulate. So in order to get the date, and like I said, we've done this last week, basically it's just new date. That's pretty much it. What'll happen is the date that is right now will be saved in the variable that you're asking the date to be saved within. Days of the week and months of the year are stored using numeric representations, starting with 0, similar to an array. And obviously, this is how they're saving Independence Day, with the overloads being year, month, and day. Now, some of you might be looking at the 6th and go, wait a minute, June the 6th is not Independence Day, and you are correct. If you do the math, everything starts at 0 in computer science. So January isn't 1, it's 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 will get you to July. After creating a new date object, you can manipulate the date and time in the variable using the date class methods, which you've already done. It's not updated over time like a clock. The date object contains the static, unchanging date and time of that value that you requested. And here are some methods that are contained within the date class. And I believe you've probably already used the majority of these last week when you were playing around with cookies. Oh, by the way, for those of you who are having a really hard time with cookies, I figured something out. You can actually create cookies localhost using Edge. Because I use IE so much, I didn't even realize that it did that. Here are some more date class methods that allow you to set specific objects of the date that you have saved. Each portion of a date object can be retrieved and modified using the date object method. So for instance, if I said new date and I saved it into curDate, I can then get that date from curDate using the getDate property. Displaying the full text for days and months, use a conditional statement to check the value returned by the getDay or getMonth method. So let's test out to see what this actually does. We'll say var curDate, curDate equals new date. I can do the typing. There we go. And then, you know what? Let's create a div just to keep within the spirit of the class. Date. And then what I'll say is, I actually know, value. So then document dot get element by ID value dot inner HTML equals cur date. Run. And here it is. That is exactly the date that I asked for the date. This will not iterate. If I asked for cur date again, if I went to the console and I asked for cur date, it would tell me that it does not exist, and that's probably because this is encapsulated in iframe. But I would still get this value again and again and again. I would not get a different value. Well, actually, let me show you. So cur date is already has a thing. It's gonna throw an error because reasons. Well, either way, the value of that won't change unless I ask for a new date. Now, let's say I wanted to say cur date dot get date. What will that do? That gave me something else, did it not? So what does get date actually give us? Well, get date gives us the date of a date object. That's all it gives you. So I would assume that's the month. But in this case, we'll put it back the way it was. Run. All right, let's go back. If else, you can create an if else construct to print the full text for the day of the week, returned by the getDay method. And here you go. What they did here was they instantiated the date. They then initialized today as a variable. They initialized cur day as a variable, and they loaded the day from today into cur day. And then they had a weekday variable to print the weekday that they wanted. Now this is completely unnecessary because you can obviously I can take the weekday from the date without having to do it this way. I think the actual get day, yeah, get day. Or is it? Maybe it's not. What is that, by the way? Give me a second. Oh yeah, it's get day. I was right. So this is telling you how to get the current day, but you don't have to do it that way. You can actually do it this way. If we click back over and we just say get day here, and then we run it, I should get Wednesday. Well, I get 3. The reason why I get 3 is because it returns an integer. So technically, I guess I would have to do the numbers. I forgot about that. Okay. They're right then. Get day would not work. I stand corrected. So you can include an array for months and then run get month, right? So we have all the months here. We have new date. We have the months. Then we said get month from today, which will give us the number, right? Obviously, January is 0, so if it was January, this would be 0 in this index location, and we're asking for the actual month, and then that will get loaded into cur month, and boom, we'll get the month in a string format, not an integer format. All right, so let's jump on to the number class. What does the number class do for us? Well, it's a method for manipulating numbers and properties containing static values. Represents some numeric limitations in the JavaScript language, and you can append the name of any number class, method, or property to the name of an existing variable containing a numeric value. That's a lot, and it seems very confusing, but it's not so bad. So if you want to do an exponent, if you want to do fixed decimals, if you want to do to local string, meaning that you want to convert a number to a string that is formatted with local numeric formatting style, to precision converts a number to a string with a number of decimal places. So if you only wanted 2 decimal places because you're doing currency, you would use to precision, and then here you would say the amount of decimals that you want visible. To string, obviously we know what that does, and value of, if you don't know what to string does, whew, no, I'm just playing. To string converts a number to a string, and then value of returns the numeric value of a number object. The number class is, or using the number class, using the number class. The primary reason for using it, any of the two methods, is to convert a number to a string value with a specific number of decimal places. So toFixed is the most useful number class method, and what it does is it allows you to define the amount of numerical decimal places that you want in your string. And we've just went over most of this. All right, so accessing number class properties. I'll let you guys go over this yourself, but max value means that the largest positive number that can be used in JavaScript. Min value is the opposite of max value. Nan literally means not a number. That's what nan means. So if you ever see it, it doesn't mean your grandmother or nana or nanny. It means and it doesn't mean that JavaScript needs one. It literally means not a number. Negative infinity and positive infinity, just understand that infinity is the operative word there. Nothing can, well, I won't say that. There are instances where infinity is a valid answer. So the math class contains methods and properties for mathematical calculations, and we've already seen how the math class can be used to calculate pi. We can also use the math class to calculate the square root. We can use a math class to do exponential equations and the like. So let's do this for a second. Let's do what we see there. So var number equals 144. Or actually, no, I've got one better. Let's make it dynamic, shall we? Input, and I'm going to say ID value. We're going to get rid of this div because I don't need it anymore. And I'll say button calculate. All right, and then I'll say ID calc, and then instead of var number, I will say document element by ID calc dot add event listener click anonymous function, and then what do I want? Let's do some things. So I want the ID equals answer, no solution, and we'll make it read only. And then that read only works in HTML5 and HTML5 only. If you try to do that read only in HTML 1.0, it will not work. So just letting you know that. Either way, let's do a square root, shall we? So we'll do what they have here. Document dot get element by no. Let's do some object-oriented programming, shall we? Function square root, and then let's do it. We'll overload it with the number, and then it's too many words, too many numbers, or too many characters. Math dot return math dot square root num, and then what I will do is I will say document dot get element by ID solution dot value equals square root document dot get element by ID, and then I want value dot value. Okay, so what did I just do before I run this? I created two text boxes and a button. So the first text box is literally the value. So I gave it the ID value. It's pretty much an empty text box. The button, all its function is to do is to execute this value, or the button's function is to execute whatever is within the add event listener. The input at the end is the answer key. It's going to contain the answer. So I created a function called square root, or squirt, whatever, and I gave it an overload of num. Now num is a variable. Within the context of this function, it's a parameter, variable, parameter, however you want to look at it. Now, what does return do? Return literally does exactly what it says it does. It returns a value to wherever this function is being called. So where's that function being called? It's being called right here. That's where that function is being called. You see squirt, sqrt, that's where the function is being called. So wherever that function is being called, this value here is going to be printed there when it does its thing. And the value that's going to get printed here is the square root from the math class of whatever the number is that I overloaded this square root function with. Now, what number would that be? Well, I overloaded this sqrt with the value from this input box, that text box. If you notice, document.getElementById value is that input box. And I'm asking for the value of that input box. I want that value to fill the variable num. This is called filling an argument or passing an argument. So while it's the variable num, it's a parameter. Once you give it a value, it's called an argument. Once num turns into a value, then it will do its magic, and it will return that value to the location where this call was made. Now, what is supposed to happen after that occurs is that document.getElementById solution.value has to equal this whatever this function is doing. So let's run it. So far, so good. Let's give it a number. The answer should be 12, right? Oh, all right. Let's give it another one. And another one. And another one. Looks like it's doing its job just fine. Now, how do I know this is working? Well, let's test it. Let's create another button called test. And I want to test this solution. I keep saving it's a habit. Let's also do some OOP here. And let's call this square root test num. And then let's return whatever's in the solution box times itself. Now, how would I do that? Let's go not square root. I want a that's not called squares, it's called squared. Oh, there we go. Power of. So base and exponent. Got it. All right, cool. So math.pow, base would be num, exponent would be 2. All right. What did I just do there? Let's go back and read the notes really fast. So I looked up power of, right? How do I use squares? Or how do I use cubes and things of that nature? Well, the math class has a method called POW. What POW is it multiplies a number by the power that you give it. So power of 3, power of 4, power of 5. The way it does that here is it returns the base to the exponent power. That is base exponent. Now, in this case, 7 cubed is 343. 4 to the power of 0.5 is 2. 7 to the power of negative 12 is this number here. So the first number is my actual base number. The second number is what I want it to be to the power of. So in this case, my base number is num, which is the answer. No, actually, yeah, num. And then the power is 2. Now, don't get confused here. I can use num as many times as I want if it's a parameter. I can use the same parameter over and over again throughout my entire program, and it wouldn't matter because it's only scoped to this function. This num is only scoped to this function. They will never cross-pollinate, so don't worry about it. So here we go. If I want to write the num function, I just need to do the following. I'll copy this so I'm not writing for days. And then instead of calc, this is going to be test. Add event, okay. And then instead of square root, it's going to be square root test. And then I want the value, not a value, but I want the value of solution. Then this is going to save in I'll save it in a div called test output. And I'll you know what, I'll format it for you. It's probably crying about the div, but we're not going to worry about that. So I'm going to stop trying to save it because that's a habit. I'm going to run it. So the test output is, and then let's run it. So right now I want 1024 calculate. Now I'm going to run the test function. Nothing. What did I do wrong? Solution is read only. That's probably why it won't run. Let's try again. Calculate test. Oop, that's not it. Stop trying to save. So the solution is here, squirt test. What did I do wrong? Oops, I didn't do that. Interesting. Okay, let me just see what's going on here. That's interesting. Why isn't it working? Because it's not value, Francis. Skinner HTML. All right, cool. All right, let's do it now. I think I figured it out. So test, there's my answer. Now, let's put this back so there's a little bit of formatting here. Run. All right, so 1024. And then I'm going to calculate it. So the answer is 32. 32 is the square root of 10 or 1024. If I wanted to test to see if 32 is truly the square root of 1024, I need to multiply 32 on itself. Or I need to get the square of 32. And there's your answer, 1024. Now, let's go back to our code and kind of see what we did here. This is the actual way that you would do object-oriented programming, in taking your code and chunking it out so that you can make it more readable, you can make it scalable, and you make it modular. That's the main reason that object-oriented programming has stood the test of time for the past 30 to 40 years. So in this case, what we did was we created two functions. One function called sqrt test and a second function called sqrt. What sqrt did was leverage the math.square root function, and it passed a number to it. Now, of course, I didn't have to do this. I could have just said math.sqrt here. I could have just did this instead. Instead of squirt, I could have said math.squirt, and I could have said math.pow. But I wanted to show you what the return did. I wanted to show you how that worked. So, and like I said, this will work just fine too. So for calculates to test not a number. Wow, why is that? Oh, because I didn't give it I didn't finish the values. So let's try that again. I didn't give it the second parameter, so it didn't know what to do. There you go, 4. Remember that POW has 2 parameters that you need to fill, and I only filled the first one. I didn't fill the second one. So technically speaking, I didn't have to do this. But this was just to show you that this is how object-oriented programming is, how it actually operates. All right, so let's skip back over, and let's keep going. So these are some of the math functions that are in your math class. I'm not going to go over all of them. I've already gone over some. And just like in your calculator, your TI-83 or your Casio G3000 or whatever that's called, it's got logarithms, it's got Euler's constant E, pi, square root. It's all there. So you can use the pi to calculate the area of a circle based on its radius. We've actually done some math functions already, so I'm not going to write this out. But this is basically how it works. You have the radius, which is 25, math.pi times the radius to the power of 2. And then I want to round it to the, I want to round the area to the nearest ones place. So, and this is what I've already said. So it's kind of funny how we've got to slide 32, and now the slide's saying it, but JavaScript is not a true object-oriented programming language. I'm going to say that again. JavaScript is not a true object-oriented programming language. It cannot create classes. Instead, it's called an object-based language. It can define custom objects, but it's not encapsulated. It's useful to replicate the same functionality an unknown number of times in a script, but at the end of the day, the trueness of OOP cannot be defined in pure JavaScript. Now, in TypeScript, yes. In AngularJS, kind of, but not in JavaScript. Now, if you want to declare custom objects or base objects, you can just use the new object. You can use the new object instantiator, constructor, or you can just say curly brace, curly brace. And this is how I create my new objects. And you can assign properties to the object. Now, assigning properties to the object literal allows you to pull those properties back. Assigning a property to an object literal is almost the same as assigning a value to a variable. And you can pull assign properties to an object literal using dot notation. So inventory list is the object literal, inventory date is the key in the object literal, and this will be the value. And whenever you wanted to pull this value, you would use this dot notation to do so. You can assign values to properties of an object when the object is first instantiated, like this. Now remember that when you instantiate the object, it must be instantiated, or the key value pair must be separated using the key, colon, value, comma, if there is a second key value pair or property you want to add to the object. The value of a property can be another object. So you can put an object within an object. This is called multi-dimensional objects, multi-dimensional hash tables. And how would I pull this data? Well, let me show you. If I came back over here and I decided that I didn't really want to deal with that, and I said var order, I'm just going to write out what they have here. Order number, '87, comma, address, and then I'm going to create a new object literal in address street. What's going on? No, okay. City is Farmington. State NY. If I can type NY. Zip code is 14425. And there you have it. Now, let's try to call this, right? So we have the order, and let's call it. So order.order number should give me F5987. So alert order number, or order dot order number. Now in this case, I wouldn't write order number twice. I would just say number or ID, which I'm going to do here because it's easier. And let's run it and see what we get. We got F5987, which is the ID. Now, if I did address, what would I get? Ha! It's telling me that there's an object here. That means that there's something in the object. Well then, how would I get it? Well, I've already pulled the object, so now I have to call the property of that object. So if I want the street, I would say street. And there I got the street. And I can continue to do that over and over and over and over and over again, and still only possess, and only have that object possess one memory location. Just one. This is why objects and object properties are so powerful. All right, let's switch back over. An associative array is an array whose elements are referred to with an alphanumeric key instead of an index number. You can use associative array syntax to refer to properties of an object. With associative arrays, you can dynamically build property names at runtime. And this is one of the ways that you can do it. Now, obviously, you can do dot notation, or you can use indexing with the associative array key to do that. It's a matter of preference in this case. You can easily reference property names that contain numbers. I would refrain from doing such an asinine thing, but if that is what the requirements are asking, go right ahead. You can create, and here's how you create the order summary. Order item I, order price I, and then I is the index of the for loop, so I is being saved to the, I think you can get what's going on here. You can also write generic code to add new object properties that incorporate numbers. Once again, I am completely averse to numbers as an object property key, but it all depends on how you want to do it. So an object method is simply a function with a name within the object. Two ways to add a method to an object is to provide code for the method in the object and to reference an external function. And here's an example. You can have this object, and then I can fill a property, a value of a key, in the object with an anonymous function. And then when I call this order generate invoice key value pair, I would get the function. The function would fire. Specify method name with existing function as a value. So process order, and then I can just, instead of writing the function here in the object literal, I can have the function sitting outside the object literal and call it or have it a part of the object literal. This is actually redundant. You do not want to do this. The reason why is because when you create an anonymous function and you place it into a variable, JavaScript inherently does not execute it. It knows it's there, but it doesn't execute it. When you call, it's called scaffolding. When you call the function inherently like this, when explicitly, JavaScript has to recognize it as a function of the page. So technically, if you write this function directly inside of an object literal or a variable, it doesn't necessarily run. It knows it's there, but it doesn't scaffold it. So it's more efficient just to write it in the function if you're, or write it inside of a variable or a property if that's what you're going to do. Custom objects can contain dozens of properties. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of properties. And it can execute the same statement or command block for all the properties within the custom object. So use a for loop to look through specific objects. So for variable and object. Now, this is a little interesting because for variable and object, actually, it would be for each. But I don't remember specifically if that's the way it is in, hold on. Yeah, so it's for. It's not for each, but it's for each in other things, other languages. So this is correct. And what this does is it looks inside the object and iterates through all the properties that are there until there are no more properties to iterate through, and then it stops. You don't have to write a for each loop and find out how many objects are in that. You don't have to do any of that. This is why I like for each, or this in this case, just for through an object. So, for statement enumerates or assigns an index to each property in an object and validates the properties within that object. Or it can be used to validate those properties. So in this case, for prop and order, what it's essentially doing is looking to see if a specific property has an empty string. And if it does, generate an error message. Obviously, it doesn't have an empty string, so it will not generate an error message. Now, if item in stock was, empty string, then it would generate an error message and possibly present that to the user or programmer. So, deleting properties. You can do it this way. I guess that deletes the key value pair altogether. You can also just say, equals empty string, and then that'll also delete the value, so the key is irrelevant. So a constructor function is used to onload. Is basically an onload function. A constructor function is what we use to construct instantiated classes and objects. So normally a constructor function is used as a basis for a custom object, also known as an object definition. JavaScript objects inherit all the variables and statements of the constructor function on which they are based. All JavaScript functions can serve as a constructor, or you can have none at all. And here's the example of a constructor within a JavaScript function. Normally, constructors are used to dependency inject specific things to ensure that a program has the specific datum that it needs, yada, yada, yada. Here's another refer to object properties with this reference. This basically means this. So this button, this P, paragraph tag, this value, this function, this dot will give you that. So if I set, and here you go, this dot shipping date to local string is referring to a object that is being manipulated by display order information. After instantiating a new object, you can assign additional object properties by using the period, or you can assign it at the point of instantiation. New properties are only available to that specific object. The prototype property is a built-in property that specifies the constructor from which an object was instantiated. So prototype array, prototype date, whatever the case may be. When used with the name of the constructor function, any new properties you create will also be available to the constructor function. So, object definitions can use the prototype property to extend the object's definition. You can actually make arrays do more than what they already do by manipulating the prototype property of the array. Basically, create your own flavor, if you will. I'm not going to go deep into that because that can be very complicated. So let's summarize what we went over just now. We went over object-oriented programming and how it helps us develop. We've gone over reusable software objects and what they're actually called. We've gone over objects, how we can use them, how we can assign properties to them. We understand that objects are encapsulated by nature and thus are hidden from other programmers, the program itself, and individuals outside of your program. The interface represents elements required for a source program to communicate with an object. The principle of information hiding is the idea behind encapsulation. We talked about that. Code, methods, and attributes and other information that make up an object are organized using classes. But we all know that JavaScript does not use classes. JavaScript has classes, but we cannot create classes ourselves. So, to us, JavaScript classes just are not usable. We can manipulate no class in JavaScript. An instance is an object created from an existing class. So math.py, math.pow, number.toExponential, whatever the case may be. An object inherits the characteristics of the class on which it is based. Date class contains methods and properties for manipulating date and time. Number class contains methods for manipulating numbers and properties. The math class contains methods and properties for performing mathematical calculations. And you can define custom objects by instantiating an object literal using curly braces. You can create a template for custom objects using the constructor function. The this keyword refers to the object that is called in the function, and the prototype property specifies the object's constructor. These two are very advanced, yet not so advanced ideas in JavaScript, which can be manipulated and used at great they can make the programming experience for JavaScript that much easier. That's what I'm trying to say. And I believe that is it. So, if this helps you, like, subscribe, yada, yada. Yeah, right. I hope this helped give you a better idea of how OOP works with JavaScript. Just remember that OOP itself is a very powerful, very well-known integral part of development. But that the JavaScript itself does not necessarily employ OOP in the way that we all know it to be. That doesn't mean you can't try and you can't manipulate and leverage the object-oriented programming principles in JavaScript. So, I hope this helped. And as I always say, good luck. If you need anything, just reach out. And if it doesn't make any sense, don't worry. You're not the only one. But I'll help you as much as I can with whatever I can. Anyway, I hope you have a good one. Ciao.